Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Now, Dwayne, is that the first time Justin Timberlake has been played on CL 650? He's going deep into the pool. Thanks. Good job. We're talking about what goes around. Yeah, it's the family law department here talking about breaking up relationships, ending marriages, and it's a sensitive subject, and I joke a little bit, but you have to sometimes in the darkest hour make light of things. David Halkett is a partner of Macquarie Hunter in Surrey, and Leah Donaldson associate, and there's three of you. Sarah's been on as well in your sort of division there at Macquarie Hunter. Now, when we talked about coming in and having a list of things that you want to divide and sort of preconceptions people have about one person's going to get wiped out, and that's not always the case, and how long you have to pay spousal support. So, and there's the hand-holding aspect that you have to have as lawyers to help people through this. Is it easier with second marriages versus first marriages? People have been through this once.
I think they know the process a lot more, so it's not as scary for them the second time. But sometimes in the second one, especially if they're older, you may have their children pushing them along to ensure that they don't give away too much that may end up going to them.
Ah, yes, of course.
I think a lot of people as well, though, for a second marriage, aren't as reticent about getting a prenup because they realize what they lost in the first one.
And especially if they have, say their children are teenagers and they're getting married a second time, they want to protect those children.
Exactly.
And they want to make sure that any assets they brought in, they will be entitled to in the long run.
Exactly. And I read a stat that said that the age group that has the second most marriages now, after people in their 20s, are people in their 50s, which obviously is their second marriage. So I remember when I went to, it was my 20th high school reunion. Granted, we were only 38, 39, but I thought I should take a stack of business cards because we go through the first divorce the first time. Did you
get any calls?
I've actually had a few from some friends from there too. But the tough part, of course, about acting for friends is you find out far more about their life than you really wanted to know.
Yeah,
right,
absolutely. You find out a lot about all of your clients.
Exactly. But at least when they're an anonymous person that's called you in, you don't have any pre-existing notions about them and stuff. But so people in their 50s, I have a lot of people that are divorcing, mid-40s, some are in their early 50s and remarriage, I say. What about you, Leah?
Yeah, I find it runs the gamut, but I definitely notice that in second marriages, people are far less, nervous about getting a prenup or a marriage agreement, we call it, which I think is better, obviously, because it sort of sets out the issues at the outset. Everyone kind of sits down and understands we've been through this before. We don't want to do what we did last time. We want to be reasonable about it and have the discussion to try to avoid some of that conflict.
And do you see any kind of trends when it comes to the age of people getting divorced? Like I just, watching people that I know, people who get married very young, often it doesn't work out, right? Like they get married and they're 20, 21 years old. You're still not really formed yet. And to suggest you're going to be with that person the rest of your days, it's kind of tough, right? Do you see that?
It's hard for me to say certain ages because they're all over the place. But yeah, if people got married really young, maybe by the time they're mid-30s, they're separated. I know I've had a number of cases where the parties got married, at 19, 20, 21, and by the time they're mid-30s, they're completely different people, so they're not together anymore. Yeah, that's what I mean,
yeah.
And
you changed so much.
Exactly. I do find a lot of people are now getting married. I was about 28, almost 29 when I got married, and I've seen a lot of people around my age or older now getting married. But I also have a lot of cases different than before where the parties have lived together and had children before they got married, and then they go in and get married. So it's just so different than 25 years ago, for sure.
And I was just last week in the province of Quebec where most people don't get married.
That's right.
It's just common law. So what advice do you give to someone who comes in who isn't married but still wants to find out what they're able to get out of separating and splitting up? Like, is it different?
In most
or is
cases,
it pretty much
it's
the same?
Similar. In most cases, it's similar. So the law has sort of changed over time to recognize the fact that not everyone wants to get legally married. And the legislature has sort of moved towards recognizing that as a regular, like a marriage, like union.
So what defines a common law relationship?
You have to reside together for a period of 2 years in a marriage-like relationship, and then you have the same rights as if you were legally married. That when you're legally married, the rights kick in the second you say "I do." If you aren't legally married, it takes 2 years, except in the case of people who have lived together and had a child within the 2 years. Then they're still eligible for division, not division of assets, but for spousal support, even though they've been together less than 2 years.
Okay, now you have a situation where people are together and they might not be in a marriage-like relationship, and the other one person saying, well, we were just roommates, and the other person is saying, well, no, we were more than roommates. Like, have you ever seen or heard of a situation like that?
Definitely, that's in Leah's area of law, so I'll defer to her on this one.
Yeah, we actually have quite a few cases that cover people that don't even live under the same roof, believe it or not. But you can still be considered to be in a marriage-like relationship even if you live separately. So there's several factors that the court will look at, and it's not just, you live under the same roof. Obviously, 99% of the time, that's the indicator, but it's not a requirement.
So you were dating somebody and you're together for 5 years and you still kept your old apartment. You could say, well, we didn't actually live together. I still had my apartment. So is that a sort of...
It's usually an indicator. So like I said, it's very rare, but we do see in rare cases that basically if you're in a committed relationship, you present as a couple, you go to holidays all the time together, you intertwine your finances. So just because you don't live under the same roof, often we see people that work out of town. So say a person that's a tradesperson that is gone half the time. That's not a preventative aspect to a marriage-like relationship.
A lot will depend. Every case is fact-specific, but certainly I think the big factor is the intertwining of finances, for sure. And also depends on the age of the parties. Like when I first started, the main case determined if you were separate in the same home or if was whether or not there was regular sexual relations between the parties. But of course that changes over time anyway. So people in their 70s could be residing together and not having that for medical reasons or a choice, but that doesn't mean they're not together in a marriage-like relationship. So yeah, the dating, keeping your own place, probably you're not going to be. But if you were intertwining your finances and you were buying stuff together and everything, you may very well be.
Okay, now what about same-sex relationships? The right to get married also means the right to go through a divorce. Be careful what you ask for; you might just get it, right?
Yep.
So here we are in this, 2016, and hey, it's people are getting together, getting married, and so is there any difference really?
No, they were always treated the same as common law couples, but since the same-sex couples can get married, they are under the Family Law Act and as well. So yeah, they're treated the same way under the Act.
Was it the same for pensions though? If somebody was acknowledged, if a same-sex relationship were not married, would they be eligible to say a federal pension or something?
It all depended on the legislation itself
At the time.
Yeah, and some provinces were different than others, but basically since the late 90s, same-sex couples have had a lot of the same property rights as opposite-sex couples, but now it's just a situation that it's actually legally recognized that because they're married, they get to divide the assets just like us.
Okay, so when you're going through breaking up and you're determining what the arrangements are going to be, how do you define, we talked about it in the earlier segment, support payments and how that's going to be done. Is there a formula, or is it really up to the judge to decide? It can be arbitrary? Because sort of on the first segment I talked about people have this fear that they're going to be eating tomato sandwiches the rest of their life in a basement apartment. Meanwhile, the other person's living high on the hog and has the house and the kids and the car. That's really not the case. We've sort of debunked that myth. But the payments to the other person, how is it fair? And how does the law see it as being fair?
Well, I'll take child support and leave spousal to Leah. But the child support is basically based on number of children, where they reside, and income. And so if there's 3 children, they all live with one party, the other party will pay child support based on his or her income. And
now what about if they own a business and money's in the business and not as income?
Well, then we can impute income to them. If they're leaving too much in the business, more than they need to do for business purposes, we can add we can what they call impute income to them and say, look, you're really making X. You're not making the 25 grand you say. Like I had a client once drive in with a brand new $100,000 Hummer and claimed he made 18,000. Well, there was no way his car payments were more than 18,000. If they run car payments through the business, then that can be added to income as well.
Yeah, because what I'm saying is if you have a business, there's a lot of things that you could just build towards your business, which is really affecting your lifestyle.
Exactly. And another thing to remember is deductions for income tax purposes. Like if you're self-employed, not even a business, but you're self-employed, just because you can deduct it for income tax doesn't mean you deduct it for child support purposes. So your car usage that you get to deduct for income tax may be added back in.
So you can be, it can be viewed on the gross amount, not the net amount.
Potentially, yeah. And so it depends. Also, are you working to your full capacity? If you're someone who decides he's only going to work 4 days a week, well, what would you make if you worked the 5th day? But it also determines what were you during the marriage. Were you working 4 days then? So the child support is based, as I said, on how many children, where they live. If it's shared, if it's half and half, how do you factor in a set-off amounts? Or if one child lives with one, two with the other, are they adult children? It's all based on the number of children, where they live, and your incomes.
And the money that you're giving to support those children and your ex, you have no say in how it's spent, right?
No.
Because that's a big thorn for a lot of people. It's like, well, you're going to Mexico. Meanwhile, you know, the kids need X, Y, and Z, right?
When you pay child support, it's the recipient can use it as he or she sees fit. Part of the rationale for child support is to ensure that the children are both supported by both parties to the best of their ability, and to maintain a similar lifestyle for the children as they had while they were together. So if they were used to someone living in West Van, say, they shouldn't have to all of a sudden be living in a basement suite, say, in Chilliwack. You know, because then they go to both different houses, and then of course they have a different standard. So they hope to try and equalize, at least care for the children to a standard they're used to. And it is tax-free to the person receiving it, so they don't pay tax on it, and it's also not tax deductible to the person paying it, so it's after-tax dollars. So it's all based on federal guidelines, which have been...
That's a bit of a double whammy. So you've got to pay tax on your income to pass it over to your ex-spouse, and then they don't pay tax on it?
That's true. Yep. That came into effect in 1997, and part of the
argument... That doesn't seem quite fair, does it?
Well, part of the argument for that when it came to child was that it is the children's money. It's not the spouse's money. And you'd be supporting them if you were together, with not getting a deduction. And also, it was deemed that it might be discriminatory against women under the charter because they were the ones who were mostly paying the tax on it, and the guy was getting
at a lower income level.
It was, yeah, for the most part. But the male at the time was the one paying it, the majority, and they were getting a tax deduction for money to support their children they wouldn't be getting otherwise.
Right.
So the government brought in the guidelines at the time, and since 1997, there's been no tax.
The only reason I question is because, you know, this child benefit that you get a check every month from the feds, well, they tax it back at the end of the year, right?
Yeah, for the universal child care benefit, which I think is going away anyway.
It's changing now that the Liberals are in power. So we talked about the child support. When we come back, we're going to talk about spousal support. Leah's going to chime in on that. We're talking about family law. David Halkett, partner at McQuarrie Hunter in Surrey, along with Leah Donaldson, associate at McQuarrie Hunter, will be back to answer those questions next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.